All right, well, let's get started. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us on our first ever live webinar. My name's Ned Bowman. I'm an outreach coordinator and project biologist here with Great Basin Bird Observatory. For those of you who do not know us, we're a small nonprofit in Reno, Nevada, and we spend the vast majority of our time and energy generating high-quality data on Nevada's avian community. We are dedicated to the conservation of bird life through partnerships, research, and community outreach. As such, we like to hold events like these to foster that community. And this is the time of year where we like to share what directions our research is taking and what projects we've been involved with this past year. So, in the spirit of keeping this commitment to our members, we are getting with the times and starting our webinar outreach campaign. So welcome to GBBO's first Zoom webinar, and I just ask to be a little patient and understanding this first run. We've worked out several kinks in the trial runs, and hopefully that's all of them, but this is new to all of us. So with that, this evening we'll hear from three of our project coordinators, one of our outreach coordinators on behalf of one of our project coordinators. And during these presentations, I just ask that attendees refrain from using the chat feature, as we find it can be a bit distracting, and to instead direct your questions to either the Q&A feature or the raise hand feature, which are both found at the bottom with the rest of your Zoom controls. And since these presentations are all fairly short, I'll be holding all the questions until the end of each presentation. And if you type a question into the Q&A, the project coordinator will answer all of these at the end. And if you choose to raise your hand, I can call on you after the presentation and you have a chance to speak your question and the project coordinator will answer. Tonight's event will be recorded and we will post it to our new YouTube channel, Great Basin Bird Observatory. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first presenter, all the way from Jersey City, is Dawn Fletcher. And Dawn's going to talk to us about our long-term restoration site monitoring project on the Lower Colorado River. So here is Dawn.
Sorry about that. Okay, you guys can hear me. Thanks so much, Ned, for that introduction. As Ned said, I'm a project coordinator and I work on riparian bird surveys along the Lower Colorado River. And for those of you who participated in this last year, it wasn't a webinar, but we did something similar, I think, at a brewery. And so some of this might sound a little bit familiar to you. But I wanted to kind of give you a breakdown of our project. So this project actually started in 2007, and then GBBO has actually been involved most years since 2008. It's a 5-year project, and it's a 5-year project like currently funded. So this grant round has been for 5 years, and this is the second season of this grant. And like I said, we survey for riparian birds, and our surveys span the length of the Lower Colorado River. So these surveys are started by the Bureau of Reclamation under the Multi-Species Conservation Program they have, and they began to implement long-term system-wide monitoring for riparian birds along the Lower Colorado River, and to study the effects of the habitat measures they have going on the river. This is the planning area. For the most part, currently our surveys are really mostly from just south of Davis Dam, and then all the way to the southerly international boundary with Mexico. The main goals of our project are to determine the presence and estimate breeding population sizes for riparian birds, with emphasis placed on 6 species that are covered under that multi-species conservation program. And those species are the Sonoran yellow warbler, which actually is not the bird seen here. This is a yellow warbler. Sonoran yellow warbler's breast actually has the red in the breast is a little less prominent, but Sonoran yellow warblers, Arizona bell's vireo, summer tanager, vermilion flycatcher, gilded flicker. I think that was all of them. And then we also wanted to be able to derive recommendations for continued bird monitoring, as well as ways to create habitat for these birds based on our surveys, and also habitat data that we had collected. So our survey method is the area search survey method. And for the last 2 years, our surveyors have actually used tablets to collect this data. So this map here kind of shows you what it actually looks like on their tablet when they go out there. In red here is the outline of our plots. Most of our plots are 9 hectares, around 9 hectares. And the surveyor actually passes within 50 meters of all points on their plot, and you can see this in the aerial image. They actually can use like a track feature to make sure they're actually passing within all points on their plot. And it's a really nice setup. You can see like all the birds you actually recorded. They have the 4-letter codes, and then any birds that are migratory as well as breeders are actually circles, and then resident birds are in squares. That kind of helps the surveyor. And the surveyor maps all the territorial breeding birds on their plot that they see or hear. And then for us to be able to cover such a large geographic area, most of our surveys are only visited 2 times during the breeding season, but we also visit a subset of times during the breeding season, and that kind of helps us to get at the bias in the estimates from the more rapid surveys, so the rapid effort. And it also allows us to get at ratios or estimate to ratios. And typically we survey around 160 plots a season. So once the surveyor has kind of finished up both surveys for their plots, if they're doing rapid survey or rapid effort, or all 8 visits to their plot for the intensive effort, then they get to finalize their territories by drawing these territory polygons for their birds. So this is an intensive survey. So, and this is just for black-tailed gnatcatchers. So they're able to, in ArcGIS Online, view all of their bird observations, and they can filter by species. They can see here, this is one plot, and there's a lot of black-tailed gnatcatchers. And then you know how many territories they had here, but they use their cumulative knowledge from going out to the plot on multiple visits to kind of make a determination of how many breeding territories for this species there were. So now just getting into this field season. So of course, one of the main challenges we had this season was the pandemic. Our field crew members arrived on March 9th, and then 4 days later, 4 days later, there was a national emergency declared in the United States for the COVID-19 outbreak. And luckily we had the crew had already arrived. So, you know, we continued with our surveys. We just had to kind of rethink the field season a little. So because California went into a lockdown, we actually had to remove all our plots that were in California. And then we also typically have, we have 3 survey crews. So there's a survey crew in Lake Havasu City, and 1 in Blythe, and 1 in Yuma. And so normally we kind of all stay together for the first month, but we had to socially distance our crews because we didn't want like one member getting sick and taking out like the entire field crew. So so crews are separated and quarantined and isolated. When we could, we obviously went out in the field together and socially distanced, but we did do a lot of Zoom trainings. But we were really lucky. We had a lot of returning folks, probably like at least 6 people returning, and a lot of really good birders. So we actually did really well this season as far as collecting data, even with the challenges we faced. So this crew isolation created some friendly rivalries, and I think also just being quarantined kind of together kind of brought out, I think, the best in people, and they really they really took these rivalries to like the next level on social media and through like WhatsApp. They were constantly sending each other messages and kind of think it helped them get through the season. Some of the other challenges we faced, we lost an entire week to the rain delays at the very beginning of the season. So um, that was basically during our trail clearing time. But this also caused the Bill Williams River to be flooded, and we had to drop 14 plots out of the Bill Williams River. And so we had to rescout a bunch of plots and do some more trail clearing. So definitely took up some of our time at the beginning of the season. And then we also, just the river itself was a challenge this year. We had several boat plots that were just north of Yuma. And a lot of that area, for some reason, there's sandbars kind of just in the middle of the river, which can be difficult if you're driving a boat kind of early in the morning. So the crew had to be really careful. And then because the crew kind of had a lot of time where they weren't able to do a lot of other stuff outside of work, they spent a lot of time hiking around. So they got to see some really cool critters. This is just like a few, but a badger and a collar lizard, a zone-tip hawk, and some pie-billed grebe babies. And then another cool thing that happened this year was we actually had in Cibola National Wildlife Refuge, a cactus Wren territory. We had enough observations to say we for sure had a territory of this bird, and this species had been virtually extirpated from the river since the 70s. So it's the first territory we've had for this species on our surveys. So I'm just going to go over some really quick preliminary results from this past season. So we were able to conduct 332 surveys, and we recorded 21,672 bird locations, and we delineated 3,780 territories, and we recorded 56. So with that, we can take questions if anyone has any.
Thanks, Dawn. It doesn't look like we had any questions. Was anyone just waiting to ask their questions? We did have a question about confirming cameras and mics were muted, and so I just wanted to confirm that all participants' cameras and mics are muted and or off. Well, all right then. If no one has any questions for Dawn, we will move on to presentation from our director, Elisabeth Ammon. She's going to talk to us about our ongoing monitoring of pinyon jays in central Nevada. So here is Elisabeth.
Hello, hang on. There we go. All right. Well, thank you, Ned. So, as Ned mentioned, I'm the director of Great Basin Bird Observatory, and we're all new to this, and this is going to be a fun experience here, for me at least, because it's the first time I'm doing this. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about our Pinyon Jay project. I'm not going to go into as much detail as Dawn did with her. I mean, the Lower Colorado River is one of our biggest projects, and there's a lot of details to report. But for the Pinyon Jays, it's more like the big picture type situation. And I'm going to give you all the kind of the big picture here of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we're going to move forward with this project. So the Pinyon Jay is very much limited to the Pinyon-Juniper biome, which extends through the Intermountain West and into actually into New Mexico, which I guess is not the Intermountain West anymore, but the core of the population is very much here in the Great Basin, and another kind of stronghold is actually the Southwest in New Mexico and Arizona and southern Utah. So, and I probably don't have to explain what to look for. Basically, it's a jay, and you can recognize it by its, and I don't know if you can see my pointer here, but by the fairly heavy jay bill that they have, and they are uniformly blue or grayish blue, unlike the western scrub jay, or actually I should say California scrub jay or Woodhouse's scrub jay, which has more of a tan back. And they occur in groups because they're highly social birds. They occur in big flocks. As you know, as a birder, you run into them in usually more than a few at a time. And usually you see them as flyovers in the Pinyon-Juniper woodlands. They very much depend on pinyon pine, and they actually, most of their diet consists of pine nuts that they harvest as soon as they can. As you can see here in this picture below, they harvest them as soon as they are able to, and often when the cones are still green, because they can actually negotiate the very deep sap that pinyon pines produce, and most other birds cannot. They have to wait until they break open. So this is a distribution, as I mentioned, mostly centered around the Intermountain West. But you can see in the upper right here that the kind of, when you look at abundances, so the hot spots of abundance are in central Nevada, and then again in New Mexico, and then scattered throughout. But you know, the large range that is in the field guides is a little deceiving in that they really don't occur that commonly in the periphery of their range. The reason we got interested in them is that not only are they highly dependent on one of the most common habitat types of Nevada, which is Pinyon-Juniper woodlands, but they are also declining, and this is kind of a little counterintuitive to most people that they are declining so much, because, you know, to the typical birder and ornithologist who goes out in Nevada, they tend to see a lot of them. When they find them, they find a lot, you know, and so it was a little bit of a tricky thing to convince people that yes, those trends are very significant that you're looking at, with the 4% decline per year, which adds up to about an 80% decline over the past 50 years, which is somewhat alarming. So the causes of the declines are fairly unknown, but there has been a lot of changes on the landscape that are very kind of suspicious, or at least some of them are suspicious. One of them is, and all Nevadans have heard of that probably, is the infill and expansion of Pinyon-Juniper woodland, which is counterintuitive that the birds are declining that depend on this woodland. And meanwhile, the footprint of that woodland has expanded, and there is more trees overall. So that got us curious, just as biologists, as to what's going on. Then the fire regimes have changed in that more catastrophic fires have occurred more recently. And here, where you see the two arrows here in the left bottom, this is the effect of these fires, is that they burn down the entire forest and then leave a fairly harsh edge where you get into very dense conditions, which actually will become important later. Then other possible factors are, you know, there's a lot of cattle grazing, of course, but then because they have such a close dependency on pinyon pines, and the pine nuts that they produce, one of the kind of key hypotheses that are being pursued right now is the decline of pine nut production based on climate change. And you can see here on the bottom right the trends in the Great Basin as far as temperatures are concerned, and which are not helpful because pinyon pines depend on surface water, or on basically precipitation water for the most part. Okay, so what we have done since 2011, off and on, depending on how much funding we had available, was study pinyon jays in various ways with radio telemetry, which involves catching the birds either with mist nets, as you can see in the upper left, or in walk-in traps where you basically put bait inside this big cage, let them walk in and then spring the trap and you catch a bunch and you can tag them. It's a fairly straightforward procedure. In this case, those were radio transmitter tags that we put on, which are actually at this point somewhat of a old-fashioned method because there are much better methods now available. But and they get glued on to feather stumps, so you very carefully clip off some feathers on the back, and then glue on the transmitter, which then comes off as soon as the bird molts. So as soon as the feathers get replaced, the tag falls off automatically, which we felt very comfortable with because then the poor bird doesn't have to carry it around all its life. So, and actually we also found with the tag birds that there was very little change in their behavior, which is always a good sign. Okay, and so with that approach, and we used various approaches for this. We found the birds, and this is what it looks from a bird's eye view. What we found, so these reddish polygons or circles that you see there are basically what the birds were doing on the landscape when they were not flying. So the yellow lines were the flight paths. That's usually what you run into when you are a birder. You see them fly over, and they usually fly and fly and fly, and they just disappear in the horizon. And we saw a lot of those, of course, and that is indicative of their giant home ranges. So this entire photo that you see here is only part of their home range. And then those red circles are the places where they landed and did something. And that was what interests us the most, is where are they doing something and what are they doing when they're there? And that involves a lot of patience, a lot of, because they're very alert birds, so you cannot approach them like you can approach a warbler and look at them close up, but you have to actually be a little sneaky because they tend to be a little wild and take off a little sooner than most other birds. But then when you find these places where they actually spend time, you find places where they cache their seeds so they can eat them year-round, the pine nuts, or they nest. You find the nests that way, and you can find their roost sites that way. And so those are the places we're most interested in because that's where we can do something for their conservation and protect those places or do other management techniques that promotes that type of scenario for them. So these are the nest sites, again, from the bird's eye view. So these, they do everything in clusters, basically. Whenever they do stuff, they do it together, and they do it in kind of small chunks of the landscape. So here and this is called a colony because it's, they're not in the same tree like from heron rookeries, but they nest nearby from each other, and but sort of like Jane Burnham called it a neighborhood, and so they like to be close to each other, and that makes it actually from a study plan point of view a little complicated because then we have to basically find these places and treat them as one sensitive location or one location we're interested in. But with all this data collection, we could now predict basically where we are most likely to find pinyon jays in Nevada. And here you can see basically everything. The more blue or yellowish it gets, the less likely it is to find them. And those are the low valley floors and so forth. And then you get into the Pinyon-Juniper zone and it turns red. But you can see in the close-up that it gets reddest if you take this kind of pinkish red here as the highest likelihood of birds occurring. It's actually at the lower end, so the low elevation end of the Pinyon-Juniper zone. So what's in between is the mountains, and we're basically in the interface between Pinyon-Juniper and sagebrush at the low elevation for the most part. So with this information, which we currently have actually also in another publication that is coming out soon, we helped the Fish and Wildlife Service, who was interested in coming up with a conservation strategy for the species because they are realizing that they are declining and that they would like to put together a kind of forward-thinking conservation strategy for the species together. And they called the so-called Pinyon-Jay working group from the Partners in Flight initiative. And you can see by this list that there were a lot of members. There were like 30 or 40 members. And all of them worked together to basically, and these were all the scientists and all the people who have actually direct experience with this species. And that included us at GBBO because we've been working on them for so long, and we're pretty much the only research group in the Great Basin who had extensive experience with that species. So we became also co-authors of that strategy. And if you're interested in reading up on that, it's a 60-page document. So, but if you're interested in Pinyon Jays, you can just Google Pinyon Jay Conservation Strategy, and it'll be the first link that comes up. So then what we're currently using all of that information that we collected for is also to help with that same Pinyon Jay working group to generate a standardized survey protocol for Pinyon Jays. And the difficulty of that protocol is that we're having a normal approach to surveying land birds is to do something like a point count or an area search like Dawn was talking about, which tend to happen at a fairly small scale on a landscape. So I kind of indicated that on that photo that the point count would approximately cover that area that is indicated by the blue circle there. But then the home range of Pinyon Jays would encompass probably the size of that orange circle, or actually bigger. It could go over that first ridge of the mountain. I mean, that's how big those home ranges are. So that little point count there will pick up the birds, but it will not really tell us anything else about the Pinyon Jays. So we have to kind of come up with a whole different approach for that species. And then we're also working on research guidelines because a lot of people, because of the high profile of the species, now a lot of people are wanting to do research on it. And we feel like guidelines are necessary for that. Then there's another opportunity, and this is kind of why I'm bringing this up here, that people who are interested in helping with this, because one of the big problems with the species is that we really don't have enough information, even though we have a lot of information, but we don't have anything all over the state of Nevada, for instance, or all over the Great Basin. So there's entire swaths of the Great Basin that nobody has actually looked at. And so what you can see here on this predictive map, that basically everything that's pink and reddish is predicted to have Pinyon Jays, but we know for sure that not all of these places have Pinyon Jays. So what would be enormously helpful is if people who go out there and go camping or do other stuff, go birding elsewhere, or just visit people who live out in, and they just stop by in some places, if they could actually look for Pinyon Jays and record them if they find them, or actually even record when they don't find them, because that's equally interesting to us, because then we know that some of these places that look suitable are actually not suitable for the species. And so we have a smartphone app, and that is for free, that anybody with a smartphone can use, that will automatically record your location, date, and time, so you don't have to worry about that. And then all you do is you record the length of time that you spend in that location. So depending on if you're just stopping by for lunch, or if you're camping overnight, that kind of thing. And then you record if in that location the Pinyon Jays are absent or present. And if they are present, what are they doing? Flying, moving around in the trees, moving around on the ground, nesting, roosting, whatever you can determine that they're doing. And then how many there are. And that's basically it. And that will help us fill in the map of where we know the birds are, and equally importantly, where we know that they are not, because we know that they're not everywhere. And this is, again, illustrated here, that you can see a lot of Pinyon-Juniper here on the right side, but you can see how very specific places are selected by the birds, and not all of it is being selected by them to do something. I mean, they fly over all sorts of territory, but they will not actually use all of it. And so those used areas we're very interested in, and we also want to know about the places that they're not using, and why, and kind of so we can start asking the question is, why are they not using some of the places but they're using others? And one of the possible reasons why they are only found in some places is that they could potentially be drawn to places that have a high probability of having pine cones. So what we did started to do last year, is to start mapping basically pine nut crops in some of the places that we study the pinyon jays in. And so and you can see even on this map here, and this is very much driven by where you can actually drive. So the mapping itself is pretty easy, but getting to those places can be difficult depending on where you are. But you can also see, it's just along these roads that were driven here, you can see there's a very distinct pattern of some places having very high cone production, ripe pine cone production, and other places have very little or hardly any. So there is a real signal there in the data that there is definitely a difference between different places of how many pine cones are available to the birds. And so we're now kind of going down the road of trying to relate these clusters of birds, their nests, their cache sites, their foraging sites, to these locations, because we feel that that's probably what's driving the distribution of pinyon jays. So, and with that, if anybody has questions or would like to get involved, please do get in touch with us. You can contact us through our website, or you can ask questions right now, and I'll be glad to answer them.
Yeah, Elisabeth, we do have a question about it. Susan Abel is asking if there is a protocol for assessing and surveying an area for pinecone production.
Oh, good question. Yes, we have one, and we are still refining it because it's kind of a rapid assessment. So the idea is that you don't actually do a botanical assessment in a sense that would make a botanist happy, but that we have basically an estimate of, and this is not to say that that's not valuable to do, but we would just not get as much mapped or done if we were to do a very detailed assessment. So basically, yes, it's based on looking at trees through your binoculars and estimating in very broad categories. And the interesting thing about that is that the trees can have, something like 405 to 500, estimated cones, or they can have less than 20, I mean, so the differences are enormous on the landscape. So the effect size of having a highly productive tree and one that is not productive is enormous. So we're not talking subtle differences here. And that's helping us for mapping. So, hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Elisabeth. And now Doug Chang is asking us if the Survey Phone app is available.
Yes. And actually, Doug, can you contact me or anybody else who's on there who's interested in it? And I assume you guys have my email address. If not, just contact us through the website. I'll get that too. And we'll hook you up with the Survey 123 app, which is what that app is called. and it's for free, and we'll get you into our geodatabase, and you're ready to go. So we'll get you there. And I assume, Ned, you're going to talk at the end about the upcoming events, right? Hopefully, and that we're going to do more of these, and then we can also then do updates on what we're doing. We have some things in the works here for how we're going to continue some of the tagging for the Pinyon jays, but we don't have enough details on those plans yet. But if we do more of these webinars, maybe I can give a quick update on those things, and then also explain maybe the app if we want to do that. It's very easy, but we can do that.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, just to sort of tack onto that, if folks are interested, you can find our contact info on our website, but outreach@gbbo.org is an easy way to reach out if you wanted to become involved.
Yeah, hunt us down.
Oh, sorry, what was that, Elisabeth?
Hunt us down. It shouldn't be too hard to do.
Yeah. All right, well, thanks, Elisabeth.
Good.
All right, so now we have, hang on one second here. All right, so now you'll hear from another one of our outreach coordinators and jack of all trades, Kayla Henry, on behalf of project coordinator Lauren Harder regarding new developments in our ongoing research with desert thrashers. Lauren really wishes she could have presented to you all live tonight. However, the recent birth of her daughter, Sage, 10 days ago has made this an impossibility. So congrats, Lauren. We wish you were here. All right, Kayla, I will let you take it away.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kayla. I'll be presenting on behalf of Lauren, and here is her presentation on thrashers in Sonora, Mexico. So as some of you may know, for the past several years, GBBO has been involved with the Desert Thrasher Working Group. This is a group focused on Bendire's thrasher and Lacan's thrasher conservation, and is made up of partners from across the range of these species in the US. They've decided to investigate these two species in particular because the previous research and monitoring data show these species to be declining very steeply, and both are quite poorly known, particularly Bendire's thrasher, and especially in regard to its life history and habitat requirements. As such, we know little about why they are declining and what we may be able to do to understand to stop and hopefully reverse this decline. Oops, let me get my PowerPoint going here. There we go. So for the past couple of years, partners in the Desert Thrasher Working Group have been working and conducting surveys in the US. And one of our goals has been to actually extend this survey effort into Mexico so we can cover the entire range of both of these species. So with that in mind, in 2020, we received a grant from Sonoran Joint Venture to start working in Mexico on both species, Bendire's thrasher in particular. To give you an idea of where we are talking about, Sonora is the northwesternmost state in Mexico, just south of Arizona. From the bird's point of view, Sonora extends from thorn scrub desert vegetation in north to subtropical deciduous forest in the south. And I will mention Hermosillo in a minute, but you can see roughly it's the center of the state and is the capital city. So Lacan's thrashers are found mainly along the coast in Sonora and tend to be found in saltbrush dominated habitats, sometimes in dry playa type areas. If you've ever been to the Corn Creek Visitor Center at the Desert National Wildlife Refuge in Southern Nevada, like along the entry road is a great example of their habitat. All right. Whereas Bendire's thrashers are found throughout the state of Sonora, but we really know very little about specifically where they are found in Sonora. At the start of this, we compiled all of the locality records we could find. These included citizen science records and eBird reports primarily. There were very few records overall, as well as a handful of old specimen records from museums that had the species in their collection. From what we could draw a few patterns from this. Bendire's thrashers seem to be found throughout Sonora, through the southern part of the state, and even into the southern part of Sinaloa. We suspect those southern records may be part of their winter range, but we don't actually know for sure. That's all based on historic specimens and older records, not recent reports. So that is one of the current questions. Are they still found regularly in Sinaloa? Do they breed there? Is it a winter range? And we have the same questions about their occurrences in different areas in Sonora. What is their breeding versus winter range? And we also have similar questions elsewhere too, such as the state of Chihuahua, the state immediately to the east of Sonora. There seems to be suitable habitat there. They're found adjacent in New Mexico, but we have not been able to locate any records in Chihuahua of Bendire's thrasher, which has been surprising, but from talking to biologists who work there and reaching out to various sources, we've not been able to find any confirmation. So it's still an open question on if they're in Chihuahua and we just haven't found them, or if they're genuinely absent there. You can see we have a lot of questions about where and when Bendire's thrashers occur in Mexico. And this is really important information to get started with any type of monitoring program. For our surveys in the US, we actually use locality data to make models. The Desert Thrasher Working Group put these models together based on old survey data from various partners, as well as eBird data. With these models, we could predict what areas would be good to look for Bendire's thrasher and Lacan's thrasher, so we could then pick our survey sites with what is called a stratified random sample. According to that design, we picked a lot of really good looking areas, a few pretty good looking areas, and a few areas that were unlikely but needed to be checked to confirm. We would like to be able to do that in Sonora, but for now we just do not have enough data. So one of the goals has been to improve this data set where these birds are found in Mexico. To reach that goal, we are hoping to get people out looking for them. The other part of this project is to build a network of partners in Mexico. So we reached out to different government agencies, nonprofits, universities, different people who may be interested in working with the Desert Thrasher Working Group and actually conducting surveys themselves. So to that end, the majority of our work on this project this year has been putting together and conducting 2 workshops in Hermosillo, Mexico. On the left, you see Carlos Gonzalez. He's a biologist who has worked with us for years and is now an instrumental part of these efforts. He's actually a participant on the Zoom call, so he should be available to answer questions if you have any questions for him after this presentation. He's based in Hermosillo and has done the bulk of the work in putting together and hosting these workshops. We invited members of the community to these workshops that we thought might be interested. We had students, professors, biologists, local birders, and members of local nonprofits. We just invited anyone and everyone we thought may be interested, and we had a great turnout. We had a full classroom both days, and we spent one day in the classroom in each workshop. In this time, we talked about the 2 species of thrasher that we were interested in, why we were interested in them, what we know, what we don't know, and what we hope to learn. We explained the significance of the Thrasher Working Group and what it has done to bring biologists together over a large area. And we also went over the survey protocol that we have used so far and talked very specifically about how to look at these 2 species. And that was the bulk of what we wanted to achieve, to really get into how to look for these birds. Where do you look? What habitats do they prefer? What time of year do they breed? What do their nests look like? What are their field marks? How do you differentiate them from similar species? And as those of you familiar with thrashers may know, this can be quite challenging, yet very important. Following the 2 classroom days, we had 2 field trips. We went to local areas just outside Hermosillo, where we know that there have been Bendire's thrashers previously, hoping the group would get to see and experience them in real life. The first thing you may notice is the Nevada birder is the difference in habitat. Nevada birders know the Bendire's thrasher as a bird of Joshua Tree Forest, like in the Wee Thump Wilderness Study area near Searchlight, Nevada. In Sonora, the areas we have been able to find them are these old overgrown agricultural areas with scattered mesquite and acacia. And this is in fact is part of the agricultural school at one of the local universities. So we went out to places like these and ran through our survey protocol, basically to do a dry run, what one of these surveys looks like. It was not that we necessarily needed to train surveyors, but more to show them what it looks like in case they wanted to engage in monitoring in the future. We also wanted to give any potential thrasher searcher tips and tricks for looking for thrashers. So very briefly, this is an area search protocol that involves a plot being systematically searched by walking grid lines. The idea is that you might flush thrashers while walking these patterns, and you get a lot of different vantage points and areas to scan for them. So you can also systematically search for nests, which can be a good way to find birds, especially LeConte thrashers. So we went over all of that in the field, and on both days we were very pleased to have cooperative Benedict thrashers. People got to see them, what their typical behaviors are like, and possibly most important to their future thrasher surveys, to hear their song in person. As many of you know, the song is very distinctive and useful to separate this cryptic species from similar species. I'm going to try to play a clip of their song. I'll keep it short because he's kind of chatty. Hopefully this works for you guys. So this is a group from our main field trip day, and this was just a great group of folks. People were very enthusiastic about getting out to look for birds. We had a lot of keen birders and folks very interested in thrashers and thrasher conservation. We were pleased to say we heard many people went out looking for thrashers after this. What we heard were going to places like their family's land and other places you wouldn't necessarily expect birder coverage. So that was great news. But it also sounds like they were checking local hotspots as well. And we had many surveyors send in pictures, which is great. And we're able to personally identify sightings or verify sightings. And we could say with certainty, no, that's a curve-billed thrasher, or yes, that's definitely a Bendire's thrasher. We were very pleased that most of these photos submitted were in fact Bendire's thrashers. So it seems like we were able to effectively teach folks about the subtle differences between these two species. So looking forward to 2021, we want to do a couple things. For one, we really want to get more people out to more different places looking for thrashers. We also want to identify some areas we think Bendire's thrashers may occur at different times of year and in different habitats. So basically, we want to get more folks out looking to collect both positive and negative data to further inform our searches in Mexico. Also, we've begun partnerships with two organizations, CETIS, the Commission for Ecology and Sustainable Development, which is a state environmental organization in Sonora, and OVIS, which is a Mexican nonprofit. CETIS is interested in LeConte thrashers, at least currently, working with the Seri tribe, which has a lot of land along the coast, and they believe there are LeConte thrashers there. So they want to set up a monitoring program in conjunction with the tribes in these areas. OVIS helps manage a few ranches and natural areas that are sprinkled throughout Sonora. And many of these areas have suitable habitat for Bendire's thrashers. So they want to get a monitoring program going for these areas that they manage. We are hoping we can help the groups get their surveys off the ground and hopefully in the future get a bigger monitoring program going. But for now, we just need more information before we can set up a statewide monitoring program. For right now, these partnerships are exactly what we need to get this information, just getting people interested and having students and other birders looking for thrashers will help us get the information we need to begin implementing these programs. So hopefully in 2021, we'll have an update with more information, more cool photos of thrashers and people in the field. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Kayla. I don't see any questions coming in, but we'll give them just a second here. Well, All right, doesn't look like we have any questions about thrashers, so I guess we will move on. Now, Kayla is going to facilitate another presentation. So we have a pre-recorded presentation from another one of our coordinators, Jennifer Ballard, about our continued inventory and monitoring of sagebrush and pinyon-juniper habitats here in Nevada. As I mentioned earlier, we're encountering some unique situations in this age of Zoom, one of them being poor internet connections. So Jen is in fact with us tonight, but due to the iffiness of her connection, she's decided to record herself presenting, have Kayla play it for you, and we'll see if she'll be able to answer your questions live. That was another last minute hiccup here. She may or may not be able to do that. So here's Kayla. Again.
Hi, I'm Jen Ballard. I'm the monitoring coordinator here with Great Basin Bird Observatory. And tonight I'm going to talk a bit about GBBO's land bird monitoring program, particularly what we were able to accomplish in 2020. So first I'll talk a little bit about our Nevada bird count, which is a statewide framework for bird monitoring, particularly point counts. And it also serves as an umbrella incorporating multiple projects. We also worked on IMBCR, which is the Integrated Monitoring of Bird Conservation Regions, and then Las Vegas WASH monitoring. So the NBC, this primarily consists of point count transects, but also area searches, line transects, and other survey methods. It was established in 2002 with statewide coverage by point count transects. And that statewide random coverage was particularly dominant in early years, whereas more recently it's been dominated by project surveys. So we have more than 1,100 transects in all of the main habitats within Nevada. It's important to recognize the Nevada bird count isn't just one framework. It also consists of as an archive of data. So we have all of the data that GBBO has collected, but we also have data from Nevada Department of Wildlife and Forest Service and so on that we maintain in one cohesive database. So here are all 1,100 plus point count transects that we have across Nevada and into adjacent states. In 2020, it was a smaller year than most years. Most of our effort went into the IMBCR program. And so we had statewide surveys as well as some project surveys, and covered a bunch of habitats ranging from riparian and mesquite catclaw to sagebrush and salt desert and PJ and so on. So here's the surveys that we did this year. And so I'll start off with our first project. And so that was Warm Springs. And that's down there in southern Nevada. It's about 45 minutes northeast of Las Vegas. This is managed by Southern Nevada Water Authority. And the first surveys that we did there were in 2004, before SNWA had acquired the property. Our most recent project began in 2008, monitoring ongoing management and restoration, but then also in July 2010, there was a wildfire. And so since then, we have been documenting the recovery after that fire. So this particular project, the core of it was 2009 to 2019. There are 4 transects now, started off with 2, now we have 4, surveyed twice per year. And then we have 2 intensive area searches, and then we have a system of rapid area searches, which we call grid surveys or a grid inventory, that we survey 4 times per year, once in each season. And then in 2020, we finished the winter surveys of the grids, and we did 1 survey of point count transects. And here are the results of our grid inventory for Phainopepla from 2009 to 2019. And I love these surveys. So what we've done is we've divided the property into grid cells. There are a maximum of 200 by 200 meters. And we conduct an area search, telling all of the birds using the plot. So this survey may take 15 minutes if we're in creosote, or it may take a couple of hours if we're in dense mesquite. And by taking all of this use information for the plot, we're able to estimate the densities of the birds using it. And by doing surveys throughout the year, we're able to see how that use changes according to the season. And that's really important, as we'll see here with phainopepla. So phainopepla are an unusual species. They arrive on the property in late fall to overwinter and then breed. And then in late May and early June, once they finish breeding, they're going to leave for that late summer and early fall period. And so in that upper left map, late April, very early May, we can see how their use is concentrated more towards that central line of the property, following the mesquites along the Muddy River and Apcar Stream. And that same pattern holds true for the rest of May into June. Fewer birds because they're starting to leave, but still in that more mesic portion of the property. And then they're pretty much gone during our fall surveys. But we can see in winter, they're back, but their use pattern has changed. They now have higher use in mesquite further away from the river. And this just illustrates how important full year surveys can be. Just looking at the breeding season distribution, we might conclude that, those drier mesquites aren't as important to phainopepla on the property. But we can see now that they are, just not during the breeding season. Okay, moving on. All right, so overall, Warm Springs Natural Area, it is an important area for breeding and overwintering phainopepla, for breeding vermilion flycatchers and southwestern willow flycatchers. And then SNWA also found yellow-billed cuckoos there in 2019 and 2020, which is very exciting. We've documented 187 bird species there, 45 of which were conservation priorities. And then we were able to document confirmed or probable breeders for 54 species. Species richness recovering after the fire has increased. So the most recent 3 years, there's 2 to 3 more species per survey recorded than in the first 3 years right after fire. The shrub-associated species, like Bell's vireo and chat and northern mockingbird, Buick's wren, those experienced most of the declines post-fire, and most of these have either recovered or are well on their way. A couple of the things that we found were that snag maintenance was really important after the fire. Our vermilion flycatchers and Lucy's warblers were more than happy to use the snags created by the fire, and it helped maintain their populations after that fire had occurred. And then SNWA has also been putting effort into habitat creation, and so we have a detailed look at some restoration work that they did near the river, where they created basically a cottonwood willow fake oxbow, and it has been incredibly successful and is heavily used by a number of bird species. All right, we'll move on to Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge, managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a little bit northwest now of Las Vegas. So our first surveys there were in 2003, and our most recent set of surveys were completed in 2015 and 2018 to 2020. So we now have 8 transects there that we survey twice a year between late April and early June. In 2015 and 2019, we surveyed all 8, and then in 2018 and 2020, we surveyed 4 of those transects. We haven't yet looked at our 2020 results, but looking through 2019, we were able to run an analysis dividing our data into equal effort bins from 2007 to 2010, 2012 to 2015, and 2018 to 2019. And what we found was that the total detections significantly increased over that time, and that our Gamble's quail and Lucy's warbler numbers also significantly increased over that same period. And both of these are conservation priority species, so that is encouraging. One of the other things that we're hoping to be able to address in the future, currently regionally, there is an increased mortality of screwbean mesquites. And so researchers are currently looking into why this is happening. And there's no firm answers as yet, but we're hoping that we may be able to look at what the impact of this screwbean mortality on Ash Meadows is doing to the Ash Meadows bird community. So stay tuned. So, Truckee River Project, downriver from Reno, all the way down to Pyramid Lake. And this project is led by the Nature Conservancy, which has been doing an enormous amount of restoration work along the Truckee River between Lockwood and USA Parkway on TNC and BLM lands. Most particularly at their McCarran Ranch Preserve. So this project then consists of that restoration reach, as well as a control reach within the Pyramid Lake Paiute Reservation. And unfortunately, because of COVID, the reservation was closed, so we weren't able to access those transects this year. Okay. So this project began in the late 1990s and actually began as a collaboration between TNC and Elisabeth before she became a part of GBBO. And it continues to this day. So we are currently surveying 10 transects twice a year, as well as 2 area search plots on McCarran Ranch that are looking at restoration areas. So obviously we haven't really looked at the 2020 data yet, but through 2019, we were able to find 123 species recorded on the point counts, and including 20 conservation priorities. What is really exciting is that we have a lot of new young cottonwoods that have become apparent on McCarran Ranch, actually throughout all that restoration reach of the Truckee River. And the growth was impressive in 2018, well, by 2020, I'm sorry. And so we have seen apparent increases in house wrens, Buick's wrens, song sparrows, red-winged blackbirds. And what's really exciting is in these restoration areas, particularly at McCarran Ranch, yellow warblers appear to be increasing. On our area searches, we are observing changes in usage. We're gathering a lot of breeding information. And again, we are seeing increased number of territories of yellow warblers, which is very exciting. We have seen decreases in a few species, most particularly western kingbirds, which is interesting. So we'll be keeping an eye out for that into the future. And so a hefty chunk of our effort this year went into the IMBCR program, which is the Integrated Monitoring of Bird Conservation Regions. And so this is a regional sampling network within bird conservation regions. And so we are partnering then with other bird observatories in the West, including Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, Intermountain Bird Observatory, Klamath Bird Observatory, and Point Blue Conservation Science. So these consist also of point counts, but it's surveying a grid of points rather than a transect. And so we've got 2 IMBCR projects in Nevada and California. One is on BLM lands within Bird Conservation Region 9. So that's mostly sagebrush, salt desert, PJ, and a little bit of Mojave scrub. And so we did 93 of those in 2020. And then for the Forest Service, we are looking at the Humboldt-Toyabe National Forest in all of their bird conservation regions. So we did 19 of those this year. So we have 16 points per plot. At least 6 of those must be completed in order for it to count as a completed survey. Each point is surveyed 6 minutes instead of the 10 for the Nevada bird count. And then each individual is recorded along with its time, the time that we recorded it within that survey period and the distance to that observation. So these are random relative to the region and administrative boundaries, but there's no consideration given to habitat or treatments or other strata. So here is the distribution of our plots this year. And so we don't have any analyses as yet. These projects are primarily contributing to regional analyses rather than trying to answer specific questions about Nevada at this time. That will no doubt change in the future, but right now that's where we stand. One of the highlights was documenting more locations with probable breeding grasshopper sparrows. So we're hoping in future years to be able to get more information on that, but that was very exciting. Moving on to our Las Vegas Wash project with the Southern Nevada Water Authority. The wash is actually the primary drainage of the Las Vegas Valley into the Colorado River. And it's really a fascinating story. It was originally an ephemeral wash, but wastewater treatment facilities were constructed at its head. And between the wastewater and the runoff, it created wetland and riparian habitats. Then in the 70s, the channel started to downcut and it dramatically transformed the wash. Massive amounts of sediment moving downstream into the Colorado River. So in 1998, the Las Vegas Wash Coordination Committee was formed, and they created a management plan for these issues to be managed by SNWA. Weir construction, tamarisk removal, and revegetation. This project began in 2005 with the San Bernardino County Museum, and then we continued on starting in 2009. So point count transects completed every 2 weeks throughout the year. So here we can see this photo in the upper left was taken in 1975, just a little bit downstream of where our study area is. And we can see that nice wide riparian area. Then we started adding in erosion, and that head cut was photographed in the similar area a few years later. And now here is that same area in 1984. So large incision, what was wetland and riparian habitat is now perched up on a tall terrace. And here you can see what the wash looks like now with stabilized banks, some riparian vegetation, and you can see in that lower left-hand corner an irrigation pipe for irrigating some of their plantings. All right, so we have not begun work on any of the 2019 to 2020 analyses, but through the 2018 to 2019 survey period, we were able to record 229 bird species. 55 of them were conservation priorities. Richness and abundance have increased significantly since we started the surveys. This is largely due to increased open water and wetlands. And as with our Warm Springs project, it's really been important to have this full season look at the bird community, because the largest changes that we have seen have been outside the breeding season. And that concludes our 2020 work. I'd like to thank our many wonderful surveyors, past and present, on the Nevada Bird Count for all their hard work, along with our partners, Bureau of Land Management, NDOW, Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribe, SNWA, the Nature Conservancy, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Forest Service, along with our fellow bird observatory partners on the IMBCR, Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, Point Blue Conservation Science, and Klamath Bird Observatory. And so with that, we are done. If you have any questions, please ask, and I would love to try and answer them. Thank you.
Well, all right. Does anyone have any questions on Jen's presentation? It appears that we do not. And I hope I was clear on how to ask questions for everyone. The little raise hand button and the Q&A you can just type into there. But if no one has any questions, then I would just like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. We had a great time sharing with you. And again, just any questions or general questions that folks weren't sure when to ask, now is the time. Well, all right then. Just so everyone knows, tonight's event has been recorded, and as soon as we cut off the ends there, we'll get it posted to our YouTube channel, Great Basin Bird Observatory, and you can tell all your friends who weren't able to come tonight to find it there. Well, all right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for help making our first live Zoom event a success, and stay tuned to our website and social media for upcoming events, as this is the future of our outreach program. So be on the lookout for more to come. Thanks, everybody, and good night. See you next time.